Hello, and welcome to our webcast. I'm Amy Pendergrass with Moss Adams, and I'm going to get us started for today's session, Economic Update and Real Estate Industry Q&A. We're pleased that you've joined us today, and before we begin, I'm going to play our housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining. We're pleased to present our continuing professional education webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session offers 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy requirements. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of polling questions. To participate in the polls, please check the button next to your answer within the slide window and click Submit. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry if you can't download your CPE certificate today. We'll email you a copy in 2 weeks. If attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet, available in our Slide Deck and Handouts widget to receive credit. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. CPE credit can only be awarded to participants registered as themselves and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
All right, and now I would like to turn it over to today's moderator, Kelvin Tetz, partner and real estate national practice leader here at Moss Adams. Kelvin, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Amy, and good morning to everybody. I'm Kelvin Tetz, assurance partner, and I lead our real estate practice. Been with Moss Adams now for a little over 25 years. So really excited to have you here today. And I'd like to welcome, and we're excited to have Charlie. I'd like to welcome Charlie Dougherty. Charlie is a director and senior economist with Wells Fargo Corporate and Investment Bank. He provides analysis on the U.S. economy as well as commercial real estate, housing, construction, and regional sectors of the economy. He regularly produces special commentary, writes indicator reports, and contributes to the company's weekly economic and financial commentary. So with that, Charlie, I'll kick it to you. Thanks for joining us and welcome.
All right. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We have a whole lot to talk about in a relatively short amount of time. So let's just hop on in. So we're going to start here with the first poll question. Now, this is a topic that's been coming up over the past few months. So what type of landing is the economy headed for? A soft landing, meaning you have real GDP kind of trend lower but remain in positive territory. B, a hard landing, you have real GDP growth go into contraction, into negative. Or C, no landing. We just chug along right around 2% real GDP growth. Inflation kind of comes back down on its own, and there is no landing to really speak of. So I believe you are able to now enter that poll question. And right now, it looks like we have hard landing at number 1, soft landing at number 2, and then a distant third for no landing. So I am in the camp of hard landing. So let me just explain why that is the highest likelihood situation at the current moment. Now, this topic has sort of come up recently because if you look across all of the economic data that we have, there's some conflicting signals happening. But one of the best signals of the economy is the labor market. And what we see in the labor market is just real strength. Even throughout about a year of the Fed raising interest rates, we see positive employment growth. So look what happened. On Friday, we got the April report, and we saw another above consensus gain in the number of jobs that were added. The unemployment rate fell to 3.4%, which is a low that we haven't seen in over 50 years. So it's really hard to get a recession. We have such a strong labor market, right? People have jobs, people have incomes. Yes, there's inflation rising at a hot pace. But as long as people have jobs and income coming in, they're likely to spend. And consumer spending is a really big part of the economy, like 70% of the equation in terms of adding up to GDP. So as long as you have consumers continuing to go out there and spend money, it can provide a situation where you can get positive economic growth, even though you have these notable areas of weakness in the economy. So at this point, I think we've all probably heard about what happened in residential real estate last year, right? Higher mortgage rates that really hit residential really hard. This year, that sort of transitioned into commercial real estate, right? So commercial real estate has been, essentially upended by higher interest rates. Manufacturing is starting to see some weakness as well, but overall, the biggest piece of the economy, consumer spending, is still positive and still growing, and that's supporting overall economic growth. So that's why you had in the first quarter of this year, you had a positive number on real GDP, right? It was a somewhat weaker number than what we've been seeing, over the previous few quarters, but it was positive nonetheless. So that's why people kind of started thinking, okay, maybe a soft landing is possible. And I think it still is, right? It's still a possibility. It's probably not probable, right? But the chances are still there. But I think the most likely scenario is, unfortunately, is that we see a recession this year. So that would be what I would call a hard landing. You can tell by these red bars, which are our forecasts, that we're expecting real GDP growth to dip into negative territory starting, in the second half of this year. And the story kind of goes like this. Okay, so the consumer has been sort of chugging along, growing at a fairly solid pace. But then you have what's happened recently in the banking sector. So I'll get into this in more detail in a few minutes here. But overall, the net result, we think, is that, okay, you have lending conditions tighten up, less access to credit. Businesses respond to that by kind of rebalancing headcounts. That starts to hit the labor market. It starts to hit capital expenditures, less investment. That's when you get the overall slowdown and likely recession in the economy. So this, the tightening in lending standards, which we've seen recently, already, we've seen a lot of, some weakness, as I mentioned before, in the residential and commercial real estate sectors. But what this is likely to result in, is a economic recession. Now, people kind of hear the R word, right, the dreaded R word, and they immediately think back to 2008 and 2009, or even perhaps most recently in 2020, which were the two most recent recessions. And I guess the good news is, we're not expecting a recession that amounts to as severe a decline as we saw over the past two downturns. So here are some numbers to give you some context here. So in 2020, pandemic downturn, right, we saw about a 9.6, called 10% peak-to-trough decline in overall economic growth. Go back to 2008, 2009, the Great Recession, the global financial crisis, whatever you want to call it, about a 4% drop in the economy. So those two are what I would call a severe recession. Now, our forecast right now is looking for something along the lines of a 1.2% drop in overall economic growth. So, we want to call it a modest or mild average recession is what I prefer. But if you're going to go back in history, this kind of looks like what happened in the early 1990s. And actually, the more I think about it, the more the present day looks like that time period, right? You had a conflict abroad in Iraq and Kuwait that boosted energy prices. You had inflation, and then the Fed responding to inflation, so you had higher interest rates, overall tighter monetary policy. It was at the leading edge of this new technology in the internet that nobody really understood yet, but was fast on its way to having a big impact on the economy. I can think of a few things happening right now that might fit into that bucket. But overall, that what amounted, in 1990 to 1991 was a relatively, modest recession compared to, what we call a severe recession. Oh, by the way, what really happened in the early 1990s, and this is again very similar to today, is you had banks failing after the S&L savings and loan crisis, right? You had a big office building boom during the 1980s, so you had a lot of empty office space, and then you had banks tightening in response, right? You had over 1,000 banks fail between 85 and 95. So banks, naturally became a lot more cautious in their lending. And all of those factors, again, about a 1.5% decline in GDP on a peak-to-trough basis. So that's something, that's what we're kind of looking for here is, again, sort of an average recession. Another way to think about this is, okay, one unfortunate aspect of recessions is you get an increase in the unemployment rate. But it matters how much it goes up, right? So, last time, you had the unemployment rate go up by almost 10 percentage points. We're only looking for about a 1.6% increase in the unemployment rate. So, if you think about, okay, well, right now, the unemployment rate is 3.4. That's no one wants to see the unemployment rate go up, but if it is going to go up, you want it to go up, not, you want to minimize the extent of the unemployment rate, right? Okay. So now the big topic of discussion recently has been, well, you had a few banks fail over the past, few months. It's certainly a concerning sign. And how this kind of relates to the rest of the economy is, as I mentioned before, banks becoming more cautious. It's going to limit new investment, new development. It's going to weigh on the economy. It's going to boost the odds that you do get a recession. And this kind of, I think, crystallizes it. This is the share of banks that are tightening standards. And this is just for commercial real estate loans. So I will say banks have been tightening more so in the CRE world, right? So if you look at the same chart for consumer loans or for commercial and industrial loans, other loans to businesses, you would see banks tightening standards, but that line there would be a little bit lower at the end, right? So banks are really looking hard at commercial real estate, and I think for good reason. But here's what's happening, and you can kind of go back in history and see what's happened, following these bouts of credit tightening, right? So go back and let's just look at 2008, 2009, which we are fast approaching in terms of the number of banks tightening standards. But you've got a lot of banks tightening standards because of all the macro uncertainty, right? And what happened was you had a pretty steep recession. You can say the same thing, in 2000, 2001, or most recently in 2020. So, it depends. This doesn't really determine the severity of the recession, I think, but I think it does tell you something about a potential inflection point coming down the road, right? And I guess the good news here is, one, so this data, I'm going to go back here if I can. So this data was actually updated yesterday. On Monday, you got Q1 results, and just imagine these lines going higher. Not like close to 100%, but, tack on about 5 percentage points to each of these numbers, right? So that's what happened on Monday. So clearly banks are still still very, very cautious. But a lot of the volatility and turbulence surrounding the banking sector, strains that sort of have emerged recently, hasn't, I'm not going to say it's abated fully, but, the concerns that, we're going to see a repeat of, the savings and loan crisis or 2008, 2009, other financial, periods of distress, those fears have sort of, gone, they've subsided. So this is the Bloomberg Financial Conditions Index. If you're above 0, that means, you're accommodative. If you're below 0, it's restrictive. This is essentially credit spreads and things like that, which, tell you something about credit and the economy. Credit, of course, is the lifeblood of investment in the economy, and that's very important for the trajectory of economic growth. You'll notice the blue line being below 0 for most of the Fed's tightening cycle, right? That means things are generally restrictive, meaning holding down economic growth. And then kind of interestingly, we kind of went above 0 before these banking sector issues kind of came up, and then fell sharply back below 0 once, you had SVB, Signature Bank, all those banks go under. But recently things have, as I mentioned before, things have kind of calmed down a little bit. Now we're back kind of where we were before, everything happened with those bank failures. So obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty here. But I think it's fair to say that the concerns that many people had, that financial markets certainly had, and importantly that the Federal Reserve had, with regards to the smaller regional banks that came under pressure, some of that appears to be going away. Okay, so I mentioned, our forecast is for a recession later this year to last, essentially 3 quarters. And this is, we talked about unemployment in the labor market being an area of strength, and that, an unfortunate aspect of recessions is to get higher unemployment, and this kind of visualizes all of that. So the red line is our forecast, and what we're expecting here is unemployment, to peak out a little bit above 5%, and then start to come down as, economic growth resumes, as the Fed starts to cut. Things become more accommodated in the economy, you get more growth. But what's happening in the labor market is a really interesting story, because it is really great to see an unemployment rate at a 50-year low of in April was 3.4%. But some would argue that is actually not a great situation for the economy. It's not conducive to economic growth over the long run. And the reason that is because this is a really tight labor market. It's great if you have a job and if you're looking to move up into a new industry. It's maybe a position with higher pay, but there's 2 sides to every coin, right? If you're a business trying to operate in the U.S. economy today, it is still a big challenge to find the workers that you need, and you are increasingly having to pay more to get the talent that you need to grow. So that, if you look at a number of metrics, and we'll look at a few of those in a minute here. But if you talk to, and I get around the country and I talk to a lot of businesses and a lot of different industries and a lot of different geographies, and they're all sort of singing the same tune. Things have gotten a little bit better. There's not as many people quitting. A little bit easier to find people, but it's still a really tight labor pool from which to choose. Still a challenge, and I think that's not, if there's estimates of where you ideally want the unemployment rate to be, where everybody who wants a job has a job, and it's a little bit easier for employers, to find workers. And those estimates peg that rate at around 4%, maybe a little bit above. So, some might argue that, we need the unemployment rate to just come up a little bit and to kind of get a more balanced labor market. The issue is, once the unemployment rate starts to go up, it's really hard to just get it to settle right exactly where you want it to be. So that's a big challenge that the Federal Reserve, I think, is going to have here. But overall, I think the big story here is, the unemployment rate is probably going to go up, but we're not looking for an increase that would amount to some of the really sharp upturns that we've seen in prior cycles, as we see in this chart. Why are we predicting a recession then? If the unemployment rate is so low, the labor market is strong, consumers are still spending. Well, the leading economic data are telling you that there's some weakness ahead. This is the leading economic index. It's declined for 11 straight months. We've never had a recession where you can go back 6 to 8 months previously and see the same type of decline in the leading economic index, which is building permits. It's credit spread, jobless claims, all of these different forward-looking indicators, flashing red, right? So this is, again, another reason to believe that a recession is probably the most likely scenario here. If you look across different industry sectors, manufacturing, that red line, again, importantly, it's the new orders part of this particular index that we're looking at. It's forward-looking. New orders for the manufacturing industry have been in contraction territory at below 50 for the better part of the past 2 years. So some weakness in manufacturing. Interestingly, the services side has been holding up a lot better. That's that blue line. So this makes sense, right? Kind of demand for services, high contact services, like travel, medical care, things like that. There's a lot of pent-up demand, and it's been a lot more resilient to higher interest rates and slower economic growth. So that is an area of economy which is, a little bit bigger and more influential than the manufacturing side of things. Consumers, I mentioned before, they're still going out to spend, but they don't kind of begrudgingly so, right? So this is consumer sentiment. It's picked up in recent months, but it's still really low, right? Normally, if you saw this chart, you'd say, the economy's in a recession. The psychology of the consumer is really bad. But what we're seeing is, a lot of this is correlated just to inflation. Of course, inflation right now is running. It's on the correct trajectory, right? It's trending down, but it's still really hot. And one of the big things that's happened that's really impactful to the consumer psyche, I would say, is just higher energy prices. So, you have, Russia and Ukraine happening, sanctions. You're essentially taking 10% of the world's oil and gas supply out. You have the opening of several major global economies. This is how oil prices are set to get a big spike here. It's come down recently because we've been tapping into the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, but still pretty elevated. But this has been one inflation driver. It's gotten better, but it's still, if you're a consumer, one price that you kind of see on the day-to-day are the prices at gas stations, right? Whether you're filling up or just driving by those bright green and red signs, so you can kind of monitor what's happening in real time. So it impacts the psychology, and it kind of drags down consumer sentiment. But as I mentioned before a few times now, Consumer spending still positive. So let me explain this chart. That blue line is consumer spending adjusted for inflation. It's come down, but it's still positive, right? Hard to have a recession when you have that blue line above zero. But if you're thinking ahead here, that red line has been negative for the past 2 years. That red line is income adjusted for inflation. So what is that telling you? That's telling you that income has not kept up with price changes. So inflation rising faster than wages, right? So you can think, okay, well, that has to have an impact on the consumer, right? If you got prices rising faster than income, really hard for consumers to grow their spending, right? Well, what's happened? Well, you have these purple lines in the background. That's the saving rate. There's been a lot of saving that has been supporting spending. What has the saving been? Well, it's fiscal stimulus, not just direct checks. It's child tax credits. It's just the, all of the things during the pandemic that allowed us, or those fortunate enough to, stay at home, work remotely, lower commuting costs, but also cancel events, weddings, etc. All of that kind of amounts to the big stockpile of savings, which has been fueling consumer spending. So I guess the key point here is that it's still there, right? It's that pile has diminished, but there's a pretty big stockpile. We estimate to be like $800 billion in excess savings that are going to allow consumers to go out and spend, and importantly, have been driving this consumer spending growth that we've seen over the past few years, even though inflation is or was rising faster than income. I say was. Let me go back here. Astute observers here will notice that red line is now back in positive territory. So for those who are in the soft landing territory, this is something you might want to pay attention to and use as an argument. Well, you could say, well, now we have inflation that's trending lower, while income growth is still pretty strong because of the tight labor market. So now you have this reversal where incomes are back to outpacing inflation. So what matters most for the economy, the consumer, well, now consumers have gained the upper hand on inflation. And, as long as the labor market remains relatively strong, I don't know, maybe you can get just, slower economic growth, and then you can potentially avoid a recession. I don't think that is the case, but that is, I think, a pretty strong argument for why we could get a soft landing. Another reason why consumers have been able to spend is the residential real estate market. So home values went through the roof, and that has provided a lot of homeowners with a lot of equity. So there's a wealth effect. Feel wealthy, you're more likely to go out and spend on big ticket items like vacations, cars, et cetera, et cetera. There are some cracks showing in the consumer, right? You got credit card spending increasing. You look at that as a share of disposable income, though, it looks a little less concerning, right? So if you kind of just looked at credit card spending, this is revolving consumer credit. It's not, it's mostly credit card spending. But if you look at this as, incomes have gone up alongside higher credit card spending, kind of account for all that, still increasing, just not as concerning of an increase. Kind of looks like we're getting back to the pandemic. But this does just tell you something, right? That, inflation's hitting certain household income segments harder. Perhaps, that this pile of savings isn't evenly distributed across the economy, right? I think if you look at the data, this is, more distributed towards higher income households, and lower income households, unfortunately, have a little bit less in terms of savings. Okay. Now this is important because this is going to relate to inflation. This is labor force participation rate. You can see, one, that it is still below where it was before the pandemic. So labor supply generally below where it was before COVID hit. Now, when I say it's a tight labor market and that it's, a labor market that is perhaps in need of balancing, this is sort of what we're talking about here. Structurally, this gap exists because there's been an increase in retirements after COVID. We have all known about the silver tsunami, right? The aging baby boomers. We thought it was going to happen gradually. The pandemic made it more of a sudden phenomenon. A lot of folks over 55 left the labor market. And you're left with this like structural gap in labor force participation rate. This is why the labor market is still so tight. Now, if you look at just, the prime age working folks, those aged 25 to 55, that segment has basically returned to where it was before the pandemic. But you're still missing a whole lot of folks who are over the age of 55. A lot of whom retired, but a lot of whom just, they're important parts of the labor supply. So what you're left with is something that could potentially be structural, right? Where labor force is lower than where it was before the pandemic. And why I'm talking about this is because you got to think about supply and demand, inflation, and I'll get to how it all relates together. But you have supply improving, right? It's ticked higher over the past few months, but still a little bit below. On the other side, you've got really strong demand for labor. So this is the number of job openings, right? Look how high it got after the pandemic. And it's come down, peaking in 2022, but it's still really elevated. So strong demand for labor, while supply remains almost structurally lower than where it was before the pandemic. If you took an economics class in college or high school or something like that, you might remember that scenario would lead the price of labor to go higher. And that's exactly what's happened. So wages, the price of labor have really shot up higher right now. This is the Employment Cost Index. There's a lot of different ways to measure wages. It's probably the best one. Running about a 5% annual rate, which is definitely, this is not conducive to 2% inflation where the Fed wants us to be, right? So tight labor market, low supply, high demand, the price of labor goes up, wages go up, employment costs go up. Importantly, labor costs go up. Now, I'm going to get into why this relates to inflation in a minute, but the thing to kind of put in your back pocket and recall for later is we have this line coming down over the next few years. So we have a recession, we have a more balanced labor market. That should take the pressure off of wages, right? So not declining wages, but not just going from 5 to 4 to 3 in terms of employment cost growth. Okay, so again, keep that in your back pocket. So we have inflation that's running high. Okay, so this is the CPI. At one point, it was running at an over 9% annual rate. Now we're essentially back to 5%. That's great news, right? But the challenge here is not going from 9 to 5. The challenge is going from 5 to 2. So remember, the Fed needs inflation to run at around 2%. That's their goal. That's their target. That's what they're looking for. So how did inflation start? Well, we had the pandemic. This was stimulus. Can't go out to eat or vacation. Shift that spending towards services or to goods, TVs, the laptops, exercise equipment. All of a sudden, people have money. They're all spending it on the same type of things. A lot of that's manufactured abroad. That puts a lot of pressure on the supply chain. That problem compounds on itself. The price of goods, right, the blue bars start to go up. That started inflation. Then you have the war in Ukraine, higher energy costs that add to the issue. Those two things are now reversing, though. Now you have supply chains that are normalized, energy costs that are lower. So that explains why we've gone from 9 to 5 in terms of inflation. Now the issue here is this gray bars. That's services inflation. Services like airline tickets, hotel room rates, medical care. Services that are driven by what? They're driven in large part by labor costs. Labor costs play a big role in how services prices are determined. So you still got services prices running right around 4% annualized rate, which again, to get back to 2%, you need to get services inflation back down. Unfortunately, there's only one way that the Federal Reserve kind of knows how to do that, and that's by reducing the pace of economic growth, ideally through a soft landing where you get GDP growth going below 2%, but staying above zero. But more realistically, and this has happened every time we've had a bout of inflation, this is what's happened, you get inflation that comes down vis-a-vis a recession. So the economy kind of drifts lower and then goes into negative territory. Economic growth contracting, one silver lining of that is it is a surefire way to get inflation back down. So I think that's what the Fed is thinking. If you look at the supply chain situation, remember that long line of ships off the coast of Southern California, that long line doesn't exist anymore. Supply chain is definitely normalized. And then, if you kind of look at all the different measures that will, determine supply chains, they look to be fast improving. There's a number of them. The price to ship from Shanghai to Los Angeles, for example, a fraction of what it was. Okay, we got another cool question here. What year will inflation return to the Fed's 2% target? 2023, 2024, 2025. I hope many of you have been paying attention, but this is a really interesting question, right? Because I don't think this is all too clear. I'm going to show you what our forecast is in a minute here, but I can see a lot of different scenarios where maybe we don't even get back to 2%. But I'll explain as sort of more answers come in here. So we're fast approaching 80% here of responses. Remember, I think you have to get 3 out of the 4 polling questions here for CP credit. So let's just move on here. 2025 is the leading answer here, followed by 2024 and 2023. And I think that is essentially correct. Now, here's our forecast, right? So here's the inflation outlook. PC deflator is the CPI's cousin. This is what the Fed looks at. Personal consumption expenditure deflator, or price index. And depending on whether you're looking at the core PC deflator, we have that getting back to 2%. Probably in 2025. We won't officially forecast in 2025 by the time we're betting man. But the top line PC deflator maybe brushes up against 2%. In 2024. So yeah, it's going to be a gradual, bumpy road back down to 2%, right? And I think it's because of that services side of the equation, that prices in the services industries, still elevated. And in particular, on the services side, you have it's kind of an interesting thing where you have apartment rents basically factoring into the inflation equation, and the way that gets measured is apartment rents are sort of still reflecting what happened in 2022 and 2021 even. So there's this lag process by which apartment rents get picked up in the official inflation measure, so it's still providing a pretty good boost. But I think as many of us are kind of aware, apartment rents have really softened compared to that really hot period. So it's not really accurately picking up what's happening there. But overall, what you see here is inflation coming down. Probably not this year that you get back to 2023. That's pretty, I'm pretty confident in that assertion. 2024, 2025 is more likely what you're going to see. Then you have the Fed, which is really, really aggressive in raising interest rates, right? So 500 basis points on the Fed funds rate target rate over the course of 2020 and the start of this year. They moved forward with that hike in May. That's probably the last hike. Maybe the employment report that just came out last week, maybe that kind of opens the door for another potential hike, but they basically came out and said what they're interested in doing right now, so long as all the data continue to come in as they as they're expecting, that they're going to sit on their hands for the rest of this year, let inflation hopefully continue downward. And this, by the way, is a little bit different than what the financial markets are kind of pricing in at the moment. So they are pricing in a pretty quick pivot from the Fed, meaning they're not going to stay on hold. They're going to pretty quickly start to cut rates just as soon as the first sign of economic weakness pops up. So we're kind of saying, no, the Fed's going to use, weaker economic growth to kind of take care of inflation. They remember, past periods of inflation. They don't want to repeat the same mistakes. So overall, this is inflation coming down, and then we have the Fed. As soon as it's convincingly headed towards 2%, then you start to see rate cuts. But that probably doesn't happen until next year, which is sort of against the current market consensus. So the Fed has been very aggressive, and they've been aggressive, and they're not likely to pivot quickly because of what happened in the late 70s, early 80s, right? You had a period of inflation followed by rate hikes. Inflation started to come down. The Fed cut rates. We saw the recession, and then inflation came roaring right back. And then so essentially you had two different rate hiking cycles, two different periods of inflation, and two different recessions, which nobody wants. Very painful period. The Fed has a very strong institutional memory of that time. They don't want to repeat that. So that is another reason to believe they're not going to be doing that. So another kind of issue is happening on the fiscal front. You have the debt ceiling problem, kind of ongoing. Secretary Yellen kind of made some comments early last week, giving new guidance that, the X state, right? So we brushed up against the debt ceiling back in January. We've been using, extraordinary measures, so to say, to kind of keep it, below the official debt ceiling. But I think people are concerned about the X date, or when those extraordinary measures are exhausted. So there's a range of different X dates. Nobody really knows for sure when that happens. The range is between June and August, maybe even September. So it's a pretty wide range. What happened recently is Secretary Yellen came out and gave guidance, said, okay, we're going to run out of money here in June. So that's sort of the early end of the range. So that's what, that's the guidance. And I think that's what I think you got to listen to there. I personally think that, I think, it's still not the most likely scenario that you hit the X date and default on the debt. But I think this current negotiation, I think it's kind of set up where the likelihood is probably higher than any of the past brushes with the debt ceiling, and there's been a number of them. But if you look at the composition of the House and Senate, in the House it's narrowly Republican, the Senate it's narrowly Democrat, the White House Democrat. So it's just kind of set up where, you could potentially have something go awry, sort of unexpectedly go awry, even though I think everybody wants this to be resolved. I think there's political maneuvering happening. But with such thin margins, I think there's a chance, unlike previous periods where something could happen. I think what you might see is something akin to what happened in 2011, similar sort of, political makeup, kind of went down to the last second, really, until you got a resolution. But, it's certainly, I don't think I don't think you're going to see us, default on the debt. But the likelihood of that happening is probably the highest it's been since 2011. And, rates are probably reflecting this, some durations here. But overall, what you're seeing here is, the yield curve being impacted by monetary policy and inflation expectations. So more certainty with regards to those two factors. The fiscal stuff, the debt ceiling, certainly, I think, could potentially play a role. But rates, if you think, okay, we're closer to the peak Fed funds rate than we've been in a long time. Inflation looks like it's convincingly coming down. Rates across the curve should start to, reflect those two facts. So we have another polling question here. Which industry is the most impacted by higher interest rates? All right, so let's go through one by one. We got A, real estate, obviously very impacted. You got the residential last year, commercial real estate this year. Manufacturing, we talked about it before. Manufacturing has been, higher interest rates slowed down growth. Manufacturing depends on that growth. So you have seen some slowdown in manufacturing. Technology, higher interest rates have upended, tech company valuation, and that's caused some turbulence in the tech sector. Leisure and hospitality, I will tell you, probably not as impacted as those other sectors. So let's move ahead here and see real estate, and I would agree with the 84.5% of those who responded to real estate. Real estate has been, last year's residential, right, higher mortgage rates. One interesting thing that's happening here is, mortgage rates are still elevated, but they're not accelerating like they did last year. They're kind of hanging out between 6 and 7. So that's provided some, certainty for home buyers, right? So I think certainty is a big part of the equation. You can always kind of go back and refinance after all. So because rates aren't going up anymore, you see housing activity kind of start to stabilize, maybe even improve slightly off of those base. But there's a really tough slide through most of last year. So our mortgage rate forecast, we have rates kind of descending. That goes along with our other mortgage or our rate forecast, 10-year Treasury coming down. So again, I think a lot of home buyers probably internalize this. It's probably more likely that rates are going to be lower next year versus higher. I think that is, again, incentivizing some people to kind of go and purchase a home. Again, we're not probably going back to the bonanza that we saw, in 2021, but things in the residential side are starting to stabilize. Even if you don't get mortgage rates coming down, you still have strong income growth. You have inflation that's not, eating away at the rest of your budget, and you have prices that are no longer rising at a double-digit clip. So even if mortgage rates don't come down, you have affordability that's not as severe as what it was in 2022 when every facet of residential was hit really hard. So this is, again, kind of tells you that, okay, things are probably going to steady or stabilize on the residential side this year. Probably not getting a robust recovery, but things are starting to look better. Another way to look at that is the average, mortgage payment as percent of income, no longer, rocketing higher. So it's still high. It's been since 1980s, but not as high as it was. Home prices starting to decline, and even home prices have started to perk up a little bit. Not everywhere. What stands out to me on this chart is the peak to trough change. Look at Miami, which is, maybe if you squint, you see a decline in Miami home prices. But look at Seattle and San Francisco, down double-digit rates. So there is a regional geographic story here. In terms of home building, you see single-family home construction kind of turn lower. Again, zoom in real quick, real close. You can kind of see some, increase here. So building permits have started to, at a minimum, they've stopped sliding. So again, stabilization. Now, what stands out to me on this chart is this red line, multifamily. So there's a lot of multifamily construction under construction. So there's, I think in terms of how commercial real estate is going to perform, I think this is important because when you look at commercial real estate, and I'm just going to skip ahead here. When you look at commercial real estate, there's a number of things happening, right? So it's not, I hear a lot of headlines about, okay, CRE, this potential area of strain. And, if you look at the office market, yeah, clearly that's the case. So in the office market, there's a supply issue. There's a lot of multifamily construction. There's a supply issue. But if you look at the other parts of commercial real estate, there's not a supply issue in retail. There's a lot of industrial construction, not a supply. I mean, I could argue that there isn't. Some may argue that there is an industrial. But I guess my overall point is people kind of hear what's happening in the office market. And the office market's about even numbers here, about $3 trillion. The overall commercial real estate asset valuation is somewhere around $23 trillion. So it's it's not an insignificant part of commercial real estate, but it's a relatively small part. But it's definitely an area that's been challenged, right? So this vacancy rate in the office market is high. It's going to go higher. As more leases roll off, more firms decide they don't need quite as much space as they once did. As pandemic leases expire, that's going to cause the vacancy rate to move higher. To kind of account for just lower office utilization and all of the sublease space that's on the market, you're probably looking at a vacancy rate that's in the 20s, possibly 30s at this point. So there's definitely some issues there. I would counter with that with, look, there's been a definite return to the office movement over the past few months, and I think as more managers gaining the upper hand over their employees, right, with economic weakness potentially down the road, you're liable to see more folks working in the office, whether that's hybrid or a few days a week. So that could help the office market rebalance a little bit quicker than more people are expecting. On the supply side, office construction has come to a virtual halt, right? It's not so. Even before the pandemic, we weren't really oversupplied in terms of office construction. So kind of all in, it's going to be a challenging few years for the office market. But I think people are kind of potentially overestimating how hard hit the office market is going to be. And like I mentioned before, retail. Actually, when I think about the office market, I think kind of reckon back to retail, what happened with e-commerce, right? Back in the early 2000s, you had this disruption in terms of remote shopping, call it that, and you saw retail construction really slow down. And it was a challenging period, right? That's still getting worked through, of course, but because supply moved so much lower, and now you have this, increase in demand, now you have a retail vacancy rate that is lower. And actually, if this was updated for Q1, it would have actually moved even a bit lower. So then you have the industrial market, and that has been the growth area for the past few years. Things are cooling off. Right, you got a lot of warehouse construction. Then you think about the structural shifts of the economy, supply chains being fortified, being moved closer, maybe not, reshored 100%, but still you've got a lot of things that are going to support industrial demand, and that'll help demand and supply balance, even though we've been building a whole lot of that stuff. But overall, you're seeing higher interest rates slow down demand, and that's led to slower rent growth. So it's been, across the board where you have, apartment slowdowns, rent growth, industrial, retail, and office. But again, that industrial line, it's slowed, but you're still looking at a double-digit pace in terms of rent growth in the industrial market. Another factor to consider is that not every office market has experienced that disruption from remote work the same way. So look at New York. Look at San Francisco. Really, not a great thing to see with those vacancy rates being so high. But then look at Miami, right? So Miami went up, now it's kind of coming down. So just the point here is not every location has experienced the same thing the same way. Commercial property prices, rents are softening, higher interest rates, higher cap rates. So prices are kind of coming down, But the thing I always point out is they went up a whole lot over the past few years. So I think across the board, you're still above where you were, before the pandemic. Mentioned higher cap rates, mostly in the office market, but essentially things have shifted higher everywhere else, right? Makes sense. You've got, treasury yields, over 3%. At one point, they're 4%. So cap rates are going to move up. So as I mentioned, the supply is an important thing to remember moving forward. A lot of multifamily under construction. That's a share of inventory. It's got like a 5 handle on it. Industrial, that's been the big growth area, starting to cool down. Again, some of the structural factors, e-commerce, right, as a share of retail sales, still pretty low, right? If you look at Europe, you look at China, their e-commerce integration is, upwards of 50%, like 20%, a little bit below that. States. So again, I'm still, I think demand is going to keep up here with that, a lot of that supply, but office, retail, really relative balance in terms of where construction was before, and it's moved lower. So that's an interesting supply story. Tighter credit conditions, especially in construction and land development loans. So that's gonna hit commercial construction. If you look at the Architectural Billings Index, that's moved lower. That's saying that things are going to slow down in the months ahead. These charts are just showing, okay, we have a manufacturing revolution happening. Again, this is for all you soft landing folks, semiconductor plants being built, electric vehicles, supply chains being built out. If you're looking for reasons why we could potentially only, avoid a recession, these are probably it. There's a lot of structural things that are going to be unflinching to higher rates or cyclical fluctuations out there. You have the infrastructure bill. Let's not forget about that. Those projects are going to start rolling out this year, maybe next year. So there's delay. This is going to be a supportive factor for the next several years. All right, very quickly, which region of the country will likely perform the best if a recession does occur? The West, South, Northeast, and Midwest. And I can say, so far, the data, we've probably all become familiar with what's been happening in the tech industry. Tech industry is very concentrated in one of these regions. And that I think is a big clue. But you're seeing a lot of slowdown in this particular region because of what's been happening in tech and sort of multiplier effect. So there's a lot of layoffs in tech. Those layoffs really haven't hit the data yet, but they are definitely happening. And as I mentioned, there's sort of a knock-on effect where a lot of these are higher-paying jobs. It's money that's not going to be spent. Lower tech stock valuations kind of extend out throughout the economy. So through ahead, I think you guessed it. That's right. The West region, the South, holding on a little bit better. Sort of the Northeast and Midwest, actually, if you're kind of accounting for all the data. It's allowing the South to hold up best, and probably that holds true throughout a downturn is very strong population growth. So, for example, Florida, fastest growing state last year in the entire country. South Carolina, high on the list. Texas. These are really fast-growing areas. And you got in the West, you got Idaho and South Dakota. Also, we're seeing strong population gains. But the point is, population growth can offset a lot of the negative repercussions of a slowdown in economic growth. You look at the payrolls as that have been regained since the first few months of the pandemic. Look at Florida, 150%. Look at Texas, 160%. New York hasn't really gotten back there yet. So there's a geographic, a regional story here. You might see, some declines, some sharp declines in the South, but it's kind of like on a net where it ends up. You're still doing pretty good, and population growth is probably the big story. And if you think about what's causing population growth, yes, it's the pandemic. Yes, It's a number of factors, are, lower taxes, better weather, et cetera. But to me, it's lower, real estate prices. So that's where housing supply is most responsive to demand. That's where the new construction is mostly located. And that's creating a more balanced housing market in these areas, more affordability. So, look, affordability might improve slightly this year or next year, but it's still going to be a tough situation because inventories are so low in like the Northeast and in the West. And so where are people going to be moving to? The places where there are jobs and affordable homes. And if you look at strong job growth in the South, still relatively lower, home prices have gone up there as well, but still affordability, I think, is going to be a big driver of migration. So I'm going to stop right there. I think we're top of the hour. I did not see if there are any questions. Do we have time for questions, or let's see?
I think we're officially out of time. So, I think we maybe had a lot of content to cover, and we didn't jump in and stop you for questions because it was pretty light on the Q&A. So I think with that, really appreciate you, Charlie, jumping on and sharing this information with all of us. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And I will hand it, or Charlie, if you want to say any last words, or we'll hand it off to Amy. And if anybody has some questions, feel free to type them in and we can respond later. Thank you all and have a great day. Charlie, anything else, or Amy?
No, thanks for having me. And there's a lot to talk about, but thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Kelvin and Charlie. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but for those of you that would like a copy of today's slides, you can download them from the folder that says slide deck and handout. And then we're also sending them via email tomorrow, along with a recording of this webcast. And then if you met all CPE requirements, you can download your certificate from the CPE progress window now. We will email out a copy within 2 weeks if you have any difficulties. And then also on your screen is an online survey for today's presentation. And thank you for joining us. Take care, everyone.